Welcome back. I am not Thom Hartmann. I am Alex Lawson, sitting in for Thom Hartmann, and you are listening and watching to The Thom Hartmann Show. I am joined in studio right now by Merith Basey. Merith is the executive director of Universities Allied for Essential Medicine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I know drug prices are too high. You're not going to get much of argument by anyone at that very obvious fact that drug prices are too high. But in fact, it's a very complicated system set up in a very esoteric and Byzantine manner on purpose to make it very difficult to kind of figure out why are drug prices so high. So I want to talk about the EpiPen, but I actually want to start maybe a little bit back from that. So just tell me a little bit about UAEM and what it is that you do.
Sure. So UAEM, or Universities Allied for Essential Medicine, is an NGO that is mostly driven by students. It started here in the United States at Yale University in 2001 around the HIV/AIDS crisis and the fact that there was a new drug, D4T or Storvadine, that had actually been developed at that university but was being sold for $10,000 a patient per year.
So let me just on that drug, it's developed at a university. That's part of this that I don't think is well understood. What does that mean? Like, who generally pays for things when they're developed at a university like that?
I'm glad you asked. The public, basically. So our taxpayer dollars go to the government, and then they go, $31 billion is spent by the National Institutes of Health and are given to universities in the form of grants. And then students, researchers, academics work on developing new innovations, technologies. They are really the drivers of a lot of the innovations we see today.
So when a lot of people picture the system, they might picture a scientist, right? Something who's working away. Probably they picture like a microscope or something, which is probably
and a white lab coat.
But they picture that person working for a pharmaceutical industry, right? I mean, that's generally what people think, that these companies actually have the scientists in them. But that's not at all how it is, right? The scientists, for the most part, they're taxpayer funded. We pay for the research. If it happens at the NIH itself or through these grants to universities, this is where the discoveries are made. This is where the cures and the treatments that people, and rightfully so, these are some of these advancements that humanity has made, are amazing. They're astounding. They are happening at universities, at the NIH. Primarily, they're happening with public funding. So, sorry, this is... I want to let you tell the story of UAEM, but I want to jump in because these are the pieces that I think we need to talk about so people understand them.
Absolutely. No, so NIH is definitely a very, very key piece. And $31 billion makes it the largest public funder and the largest funder of global health research in the world, actually. So this is larger than a lot of pharmaceutical corporations. So despite what people think, it's a very nice myth, actually, that has been allowed to continue, that actually pharmaceutical corporations are the ones who are driving most of this innovation. That's actually not true. And
I want to get to what they are doing a little bit later, but tell me about the genesis of UAEM. So you're at Yale. This drug has been developed primarily with public funding. It's critical for saving lives, extending lives, for quality of life, and yet this company is actually making tons of profit specifically by restricting access to it, so by raising the price to a level that people cannot afford, right?
Absolutely. So this was a life-saving drug at the time. It was a new drug. And it had been developed on campus with NIH funding, with public funding, by a scientist there at the University of Yale. At the time, we were looking at the epidemic. You're seeing millions of people in South Africa, particularly, dying from HIV and AIDS. And they didn't have access because a group called Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, wanted to treat people living with HIV, but they couldn't because the price per treatment was just so high. And a young activist who is a lawyer, who is now actually a lawyer at Yale, so her activism was seen favorably. She got together with other young students and rallied around this particular drug and tried to get Yale University to change the licensing agreement, because it held the patent, to change the license with Bristol Myers Squibb, which was the company in question at the time. And basically, initially, they said, no, this is impossible. This is a license, this is an agreement. But these things happen to be man-made, and there's always an option to change them. And with some advocacy and organizing and some a sense of justice, Amy and her fellow colleagues were able to ensure in a short time that they changed the license to enable generic competition, basically, and to drive down the price. And for the first time, MSF, Doctors Without Borders, were able to treat people living with HIV in South Africa.
Ballpark, what, it was $10,000, and then what after this impossible thing from the pharmaceutical corporation's point of view happens, what about is the price afterwards?
The price dropped from $10,000 per patient per year for this one drug to by less than 90% of that. So now we're looking at under $100 for this drug, and generic competition is the way to do that. And
I really think, Thom's listeners understand this stuff really well, but I just really want to spell it out. That there was nothing in that $9,900 except for the fact that the corporation could get away with it, right? That they knew that they had a monopoly that was granted to them over a life-saving medication. And so some people were actually willing to pay. I mean, how much would a person pay to save their own life, right? That's the problem. Monopoly over people's health leads to something like $10,000 a year. I want to spell out one other thing. It actually is in the drug company's interests. They know that, let's say there's 1,000 people who need something, but they can actually charge 10 of the people $100,000. That is actually more profitable to them than if they price it at what the drug costs, because pills cost pennies. It's greed that costs lives.
Absolutely.
I will want to get into how the system actually is set up to enable this. And it's not like an evil CEO who's acting incoherently or a bad apple. It's actually the entire system is set up like this. We're going to do that through EpiPen, and we're going to continue the discussion about how we can actually change that. But there's this part of the story you just told that I think is really important. They said it was impossible, right? They said, oh, you can't do that. This is an agreement. These patents are, clad in iron thing. And none of that is true, right? It's a privilege that is granted, and there can be obviously restrictions put on that privilege.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Show. I'm Alex Lawson, sitting in for Thom, and we are here joined by Merith, talking about drug prices, that they are too high. Everyone understands. Why they are too high is a little bit less understood, but I'm going to kind of sum it up by saying that there is a system that has been built that will inevitably lead to exactly what we see today with drug prices being too high. We could get a company by company to lower a drug price or something like that, but the system itself is set up primarily to enrich greedy liars on Wall Street and the front groups that they have in these front offices of the pharmaceutical industry. But we're really seeing, and we're probably a decade into a financialization of pharmaceutical industries. So they're not competing in any way on creating new inventions or innovations. It's really about market share and merging finding and identifying what they're going to call undervalued assets, which are life-saving and life-extending and quality of life medications, and then jacking the price up on those as high as they can go. And unlike a candy bar or something like this, when this means that somebody's health is in danger, right? The one that I think a lot of people have heard about recently is the EpiPen and the company Mylan, who's increased the price of the EpiPen, which is for allergic reactions. And they've increased that hundreds and hundreds of %. And the reason they're doing it is because they're chasing, the executives are chasing a stock package that incentivizes them to the tune of millions of dollars only if they hit a very specific stock target, right? It has nothing to do with producing the best medicine or anything to do with health outcomes or anything like that. Let's get into, we can start at the EpiPen, but I know that a big thing that you want to talk about is how EpiPen is not, it is not at all unique. There's insulin, for example, and a host of other it's actually just the entire system is set up like this.
Yeah, absolutely. This system is set up for shareholders, basically, and the incentives are not aligned with patient needs. And that's what it really comes down to, I think. We would see a very different system, and we would see different innovations if the system had been set up to incentivize people over profit, basically. As you said, EpiPen is one example of many. You know, there was this 550% hike over the last number of years, which absolutely mirrored the CEO's increase in salary as well.
Although actually the only thing that went up faster than the price of the EpiPen was the CEO's salary.
Even more. But basically what we're seeing cancer drugs that are over $100,000 a year. There's, let's see, a prostate cancer drug that's $129,000 called Xtandi. We're seeing hepatitis C medication, $84,000 a year. Insulin prices are going through the roof. We've seen that because of this system, when Ebola hit in West Africa and people started getting nervous over here, there was actually a treatment that was 100% effective in primates that just sat on a shelf for a decade before because the system said there's no financial incentive for us to put this out until there was this enormous epidemic and 11,000 people died.
Well, there is a huge financial incentive for there to be Viagra lookalike after Viagra lookalike after Viagra lookalike, right? Because that is what we're talking about in terms of the system. They're not... It's not even incentivizing the creation of new drugs, because if you were to compete on, even if like you were just, a CEO is just driven by greed, but the system right now would not allow their greed to say, oh, I should invent the next amazing drug that's going to do amazing things. That would not make them a lot of money.
But this is exactly why we haven't found an antibiotic, which is really the next thing that we should be worried about from a public health perspective. We haven't seen a new antibiotic in 30 years. And the reason for this is because the system is set up not for people fundamentally, because there isn't perceived to be a financial incentive in this yet. And the same thing with Zika. It was a sort of relatively unheard of disease, not from where it came from, of course, but until it started infecting people in other parts of the world, wealthier parts of the world. Now there's this race to find a diagnostic. Had the system been different, I would argue for sure that we would have certain things in place, including diagnostics and possibly a treatment already, so that we could prevent some of the tragedies that are happening.
So this is something that I really am always looking to how to explain this to people, because I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding, and I think we've edged around it. But what we're saying is that it's in fact the high drug prices that are getting in the way of innovation, that are getting in the way of invention. the system right now only functions on these incredibly high drug prices, which means they're not competing to create new cures, to create new treatments. But I think that a lot of people's understanding of drug prices is drug prices are too high. When people can't afford the EpiPens for their children with a peanut allergy, for example, it's outrageous to them. And then there's a momentary outrage, and then maybe we can address one thing by one thing. But at the core, I think there's a misunderstanding that if we lower the prices of drugs, if we change the system, that we will get less innovation or invention. And in fact, if we lower drug prices, which will happen by putting the incentives correctly, right? So that the incentives are not to figure out which drugs you can jack up the price 9,000%, but the incentives are to create new and novel treatments and cures. What we're going to see is lower drug prices and more treatments and more cures. That is a concept that is so obvious, I think, to people in the public health world like yourself. People who spend a lot of time looking at this and just how broken our system is. But I don't think that's that well understood out in the general public.
Yeah, and we try not to use broken system because the system is working really well, just not for people fundamentally. It's working for those shareholders. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is patents in the beginning were set up to actually enable innovations to be in the public sphere, but this has changed.
We're going to talk about this and some ideas that we can go after to change the system to incentivize what we want to happen and not what's currently happening.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And we'll be right back talking about getting the incentives correct on high drug prices right after this.